Hi there, welcome to week 6. Week 6, we're going to talk about risk. We're going to talk about just a bit how contracts play into managing some of that risk. And then we're also going to touch on total addressable market size, which can be a risk if not considered when you're thinking about planning out your financial model. So with that, I'll share screen and we'll go into a couple slides. Let me get to slideshow. So first of all, we all know events are risky business. That is not news, I know. And considering risk and quantifying it in a way that is understood or at least might be accepted by the executive office is important. It also protects your financial position. And so if we're presenting an idea or presenting a concept or wanting to change something that a business is doing or that a client is doing, we want to make sure they know we're considering the risks involved and how they are mitigated, insured, or that we have a contingency for. So first we'll go through the mindset. You know, I'm a mindset first person. So what's our mindset around risk management? Well, the good news is there's accepted codified methodology around the world of how risk management is thought of. And a lot of you might have been through this before. To some of you, this might be new. But really, when you're thinking about risk, it usually falls in a matrix. And it's the probability that might happen and the impact, or the frequency and the impact. So the way I think about this is a mosquito bite. It happens a lot. It's got a very high probability of happening in the summer, but the impact is pretty low. As long as that mosquito isn't carrying anything, it's a high probability, low impact issue. On the opposite, farthest end, if you want to think about this, nuclear war, very low probability of happening, hopefully, but a very high impact. So really, when we're looking at risk, we want to know what's in the high probability, high impact, or for most of what we're considering, if we have to mitigate, insure, or have a contingency for it, it's usually in the medium impact space. Now, there's another video that explains this in a lot more detail, so I'll stop there, but that is just very quick snapshot. And then the second piece of what is codified and accepted in the world of risk management is something like this. You can find a lot of things on the internet, whether it's the circle or whether it's a progression, but you usually identify the risks, you rank them because all risks are not equal in that matrices, and then you control for them using these 3 tools we'll talk about today, or you accept them. And acceptance is also a part of risk management. But as long as we've identified that we're accepting them, then that is normally what any business or client would want to know that we had done. So you control for it, you identify it, you analyze, you take some sort of action about that risk, you monitor it. Did that work? Did our risk management plan work? Then you control for it moving forward. Mitigation. A lot of you have heard this before. This, again, probably isn't new, but I always like to think about the actual definition because as we use these 3 tools, it's helpful. So you want to reduce the severity, the seriousness, or the painfulness of something. My example for mitigation is a car airbag. It's not going to stop you from having an accident, but it is going to reduce the chances that that accident could be a serious occurrence because it's mitigating against injuries. So just one example. Contingency. We all know about contingencies. A lot of you probably have them in your budgets already, and I've seen that. You're creating a provision for that unforeseen event or circumstance or an incidental expense. So the incidental expense could be that contingency line item in a financial model or a budget. A provision might be you have an overflow hotel. That's it, or an overflow room for live streaming when we may have too many attendees trying to get into general session. Insurance, we all have insurance. So we know about this, but you'll see an interesting article this week that talks about kind of the government creating a plan for getting involved in the insurance game when an industry is facing large unforeseen costs, which I think is really interesting and beneficial for our particular sector. But we can also insure. So sample categories of risk, obviously this doesn't cover them all, but things for you to think about. I always like to say that you need to consider yourself in any event situation because liability is out there, as we all know. I bet some of you in this class have gone through either witnessing through a business or yourself may have gone through being sued been party to a lawsuit, been named in a lawsuit. America is fond of its suing abilities. So you need to think about your relationship, and especially as a small business owner, or some of you business owners there, how are you positioning yourself with regards to an event and your risk? Of course, your organization, if you're an employee, you're thinking about the risk to your organization and how that would be managed. Your team, you have to think about your team, especially as we think about COVID. I've been thinking a lot about my team and how they're in a position of risk, just even by going to an event, being at an event, having a lot of people around them. That just doesn't apply to COVID. It applies to a lot of things that we do, of course. We take clients on hikes and on experiences, and so what is the risk involved in doing that? Your attendees, of course. The locale can be risky for lots of reasons. Hurricane seasons, tornadoes, climate change, there's plenty. The venue and the vendors, they actually introduce risk. As soon as you hire a vendor, that is already introducing risk, which is why we'll talk about additionally insured. The venue could itself be a risk. There have been venues that have been found to have mold, have bed bugs, have all sorts of things that are interesting and exciting. Reputation is definitely a risk, especially in the age of social media. That's what we think about a lot for our clients. And of course, cyber is rising in occurrences. And for those of you that may work with financial institutions or pharmaceutical institutions, they're consistently thinking about cyber. People are coming into lobbies where they know a conference is being held and trying to hack into computers or systems when they know those types of employees or representatives are at a particular hotel. And especially if that hotel has open internet access, they're using that as a way to get into any of those accounts. So questions around mitigation. When we think about how we can mitigate for some of these risks, how we can create airbags, not taking away the fact that it's going to happen, but that we might be able to reduce the severity. So we all know force majeure, that can reduce the severity of attrition or a massive attrition clause that comes into being if we can't get all of our attendees there. We'll talk about commercially impracticable clause when we talk about insurance more. Do you have policies for restriction or removal of attendees? We might want to mitigate for security moments or incendiary comments being given by attendees. How can we mitigate maybe the painfulness of that if that's an issue for what you work in? Are you choosing a city, a country that is safer than others? And safer, I mean also in the political realm, because as we've noted, right now, California has 18 states that California state employees cannot travel to because of the political positions of other states. So safer can mean a host of different definitions. And what is your responsibility to mitigate or guarantee the actions of other vendors, venues, staff, creating that safe space or creating just general professional conduct and standards? For contingency, what are you planning simultaneously as backups? And that could be seen as responsibility for you or for your organization. Again, sometimes it's not as much legal. It can be what is perceived to be your responsibility around creating contingencies. How are you thinking of contingent budgets in your financial models with regards to airfare? Max capacities are shrinking because of COVID restrictions. They could shrink for other restrictions. I don't want to just focus on COVID, but that max capacity could be flexible for a lot of different reasons. F&B cost, what's our contingency around those continue to increase as there's talk about a worldwide food crisis right now. And hotel capacities are shifting because of staff shortages. So do we have a contingency for overflow hotels if a particular hotel we've chosen does not have the staff? Executive travel policies shift all the time with regards to safety and also expense. And then what happens if laws change? Do we have contingencies if policies start to shift around quarantines, vaccine mandates, a host of others? Right now in 2023, United States citizens will need a visa to travel in the EU. So that is a change of law that will affect whether folks are able to come to international conferences if you're having US folks come in, and custody of care. Just some questions that I think are good to go through in your mind as you're thinking about contingencies. How can these be set up to account for unforeseen occurrences? And then insurance. I would love to run an entire seminar just on insurance and interview a host of insurance professionals because I find it a fascinating field, mainly because of the restrictions. And I know we've all experienced this in our own lives, probably frustratingly so, around what the restrictions are, and no less as well probably for events. What kind of restrictions are they putting in? Right now the focus is on contagious diseases. How do you insure against the potential occurrence of an outbreak or a hotspot? But the issue there is we looked into Ebola coverage way back when that was popping up in countries that were going to affect attendance to one of our conferences. And what we found is that the definition that the insurance company was going by was so porous that we would never have been able to, we didn't think, recoup any funds for our client if they bought this particular coverage. So I think there's a lot of, as the insurance industry loves to do, say that they're going to insure something, but only under such specific, tiny, nuanced circumstances that the ability of you to recover those funds are probably minimal. What's your responsibility to insure? We've personally seen a lot of hotels and venues are increasing their insurance requirements to sign a contract. They rarely check, but of course the responsibility is on the signatory to have that insurance in place. And there's some fine print we've seen in various venues. There are also laws for a certain amount of insurance you must carry that vary from country to country, state to state. So you want to make sure you're following those as well. And then where the attendee's coming from is an interesting thing that you might be able to insure for, that if attendees are coming from certain countries, that you could potentially insure if they are not able to travel, that you could recover funds from them not being able to travel into your conference. And the big thing that we've seen with insurance is that the official language and proclamations, who does the insurance company deem is the expert? Is it the WHO? Is it the CDC? Is it some other international body? Because whoever's going to proclaim it a pandemic or an endemic, sometimes that is the trigger point for insurance to come into play and be valid. All these are important to know because if you think you're insuring the financial position and there's an insurance company saying that does not qualify, then your financial position is lost. So what are some tactics that we can use with contracts? And these are just lightly touching on this. Again, hoping that we can do a more robust contract discussion in this class, but we'll see how that plays out. But just for this purpose, force majeure. We know that is a way to mitigate against unforeseen occurrences happening. Usually it states, acts of God, acts of countries, things that were out of the control of either party. Usually we think of hurricanes, floods, fires. Good force majeure clause will cover that. Also strikes, labor strikes, things like that. Having a cancellation or postponement, a lot of you I'm sure have that. Postponement becoming more favorable, as we know, by the venue and hotel industries, and sometimes that works for both parties. What I find interesting that I've seen more often, and we are putting in the contracts for our clients with hotels and venues, is commercially impracticable and frustration of purpose. So those two are really around, can your event take place for the goal it had given the circumstances of the time? And broad, vague definitions can sometimes help and can sometimes hurt. The reason they can sometimes hurt is because if it's too broad, then you're going to end up in court, and the judge or a jury is going to decide what that definition really was. Sometimes broad can be helpful because that means you can say certain circumstances frustrated your purpose to have the event, and you could claim that hey, it could be COVID, it could be a snowstorm in Canada frustrated your purpose to have Canadians travel for a US based event around the financial systems of Canada and how they're related to the US. Well, if you can't get your Canadians in because there was a huge snowstorm, that frustrated your purpose. So sometimes having broad language like that is helpful, or some lawyers recommend that frustration of purpose be very defined around what your purpose is. What is the purpose of this event? And if you can get a hotel or venue to sign off on that and your purpose can't be met, your goal for the event, then you could be free and clear. I personally am a fan of both of those, particularly the frustration of purpose, because I think in goals. As you know from our first lecture, I think in value, goals, cost. That's how my brain works. So I see frustration of purpose as mapping to that extraordinarily well if written well into a contract. And that can really secure your financial position. So something to look into. A tactic around contingency. First of all, as you know, we want to quantify how much is this contingency worth. I'll go to the example of having an overflow hotel. This might not apply to all of you, but it's, I think, a good example. So if you had to get an overflow hotel and the cost of that is potentially putting in that you have a financial liability of $300,000, but maybe the whole event isn't even worth that to you, well, then the contingency outweighs what the value is anyway. So you want to see how much are these contingencies worth. Having a live stream overflow lounge might not be that much money. Maybe it's $20,000 to have the overflow lounge, but you're able to sell a bunch more tickets. This would be a variable cost potentially, a fixed cost of your live stream, but you'd want to overcome it with your ticket sales. Maybe that's worth it. You want to map that value to loss and really do a cost benefit analysis, which we'll talk about more in week 7. And then when, that's the biggest part. When will you make these contingent decisions? Because contingencies usually have a go, no go as to when you're doing them. For instance, contingency of an overflow hotel, when are you going to definitively guarantee that financial liability to your organization or your client? And that has to be mapped to a timeline. So the interesting part I find around contingencies is not always, but often they're timeline dependent risk management tools. To keep that in mind. All right, just a couple stories from the field. I find they're always interesting. I think having a day or a couple hours where we do a cocktail hour and share all our stories would be kind of fun because it reminds us that risk is out there and it can have a huge financial impact. We went through a fire at one of our events. The fire burned down the main hotel that had housed all of our top VIPs. No one was harmed, but over 160 some people were staying there, so all their things were there. We were in the general plenary, and it was the largest fire that Oxford had ever seen. I mean, it was written up everywhere. And so we had to spend 36 hours a week getting all of their belongings out, and some pretty significant items. You know, things like heart medication had to be timely gotten out of there, breast pumps. We had medical equipment that people had brought with them, you know, for breathing, and trying to replace all those items took priority over even just passports, luggage, etc. We did have an additionally insured policy. We were able to speak to the hotel about how they were going to replace a lot of our attendees' goods. Obviously, that wasn't necessarily our responsibility to do in the middle of that, but we would have been brought in as a party because we were clearly a part of this. We would have been able to transfer liability to the Randolph Hotel, which would have been good, but we would have been in the mix. And all of our insurance policies were current and they matched directly to what the hotel would have needed. And we were able to get every person's belongings back, or at least we were able to help them connect to get their materials paid for that had burned. Pretty exciting. The volcano, we were also stuck in England when that Iceland volcano went off. I forget the year. And that was exciting because that was a very different way to maneuver through how much responsibility the organizer has in continuing to house people, over 200 some people over a week when this volcano was restricting all air travel over Europe, and how much responsibility the attendees had. So that was more, I would say, of an issue of managing reputational risk for our client, of whether they should, whether they legally had to do so, or whether they optically had to do so. There was one time where I get migraines. I had a lot of sympathy for this person. The person had a migraine and threw up on the shoes of the Duchess of York. That was interesting. And we had to make sure that this woman was taken to the hospital in time. Of course, we had to replace some shoes. I didn't have a contingency for that one. And managing that woman's experience, I'm sure a lot of you have had some medical issues on site. You always have to have, first aid on site. And then how do you ensure you've documented and tracked how that person was cared for? And then, of course, we've had rogue photographers. I bet a lot of you have too, that have set up a tripod, created a trip hazard, someone tripped, and where does the liability fall? Thankfully for us, we were able to very clearly draw that fell into that poor photographer's lap. And I think that photographer learned a very, very strong lesson that day in liability and risk management, and the fact that you should not set up a tripod in a very busy area. Two other stories, of course, of risk management that are, one very tragic, the Texas concert recently. A lot of organizers there within that event for not potentially following risk management protocol. We don't know. That's winding its way through the courts. But a massive incident. And then, of course, Fire Festival, which is it's amusing because no one had, significant outcomes there. But, the organizer who produced that went to prison for a while. So you can really have a lot of liability financially and, of course, in harming people, which is not good. So, again, why we take this seriously. Reputational risk, I think, is always good to speak about. How are the rules perceived that you put into place with your events, and how are they executed? Both of those are important because sometimes you put in great plans, but how are they perceived from the outside world? Secondarily, if vendors or event staff or people far down the chain are executing those rules, are they doing it the way that you'd want? And what I always think about is what could happen on social media. If you have a staff member, an event staff member way down the line saying someone can't come in because of X, Y, and Z, what would be the Twitter test? If someone put that on Twitter, how would that appear? One example I think of that comes to mind is there was a women's conference that I went to, and a woman was not let in because she wanted to breastfeed in the back of the room. Now, should she be allowed to do that? Should she not? I don't know. But what I do know is they turned her away at the door. She posted it on Twitter, and she happened to be a very big deal, and that went viral immediately. And that was a very bad occurrence for the organizers of that conference. And they had to do a lot of backtracking, probably impacted their financial position quite a bit, definitely the reputational position. And then if something does happen, let's say like that or anything else, the biggest thing is to make sure everyone knows their role. It's in a crisis. And even more importantly, how do they communicate what's happening and how do they document it? We have a host of tools that we use, but how we use them in a crisis might change. Unity is one of those app-based walkie-talkies, Slack, WhatsApp, Google Docs, Teams, whatever you use, but communicating and documenting things in a crisis is critical for that communication plan when something happens, because that can create even more problems if they're not attended to. And then just obviously we have risks moving forward, much more than COVID, but how do we think about the ramifications that an audience and the responsibility an audience or a customer or consumer has to take on versus our responsibility? And I think it's really interesting to follow the baseball rule. This came about in the early 1900s when they were building baseball stadiums, and people were getting clocked by those foul balls. And so there was, in a sense, a ruling that there is a certain amount of risk that the audience takes on by coming to a baseball game. There are errant baseballs at a baseball game, but there was a significant responsibility on behalf of the organizer to put up massive fences right behind home plate where there was the highest probability and the highest impact of a foul ball coming off those bats. So going back to that risk matrices, that is where the government came down is, wait a minute, there is one area that has high probability and high impact, and you, organizer, have to account for that. So that's where you get those big foul ball fences that have been built up. And yet the rest of it, lower probability, lower impact, still could be medium impact, but that fell onto the audience. That if you go in there, it's a bit like the skiing tags you get that say, by skiing, there's trees, and you are going fast down a hill. So there is a chance, low probability, but high impact, that could occur. So I think that's an interesting way of continuing to think about it, as that baseball rule. And that's really what Disney World took on when the whole COVID crisis happened, is they kind of went to the baseball rule by saying, look, by entering a massive amusement park, you accept that there is some risk of any communicable disease, not just COVID, anything. You've got a lot of humans running around, touching things, eating. There is a risk by entering this property. What Disney World can't do is say, we ameliorate ourselves of all risks. We have to be responsible business owners, but you don't have to account for every single thing, just like baseball didn't have to build an entire dome of fencing. They only had to build that foul ball fencing right around home plate. So these are just some interesting kind of in that baseball rule genesis of saying you abide, and skiing, you accept there's certain risks. Right here you can see, hey, this is what we're hoping you do, this is what we do, and this is just for COVID, of course. And then same with standards and practices are coming aboard, and now you've got all these different organizations saying not only are they adhering to them, they might be going past them, trying to use this as a competitive advantage and a value proposition that you should stay at our location over other locations because, hey, we not only meet, we exceed some of these protocols that have been given. And I just had to do a shout out to MPI chat boards. I know MPI is a part of this program, but I also find it a really good resource to find out what other folks are doing with risk management, how they're creating mitigations, contingencies, what they're finding in insurance law and precedent as that's changing. So I'm just going to do a shout out for them. And then just a couple last thoughts is cheaper can be more expensive, especially in risk. And we know this, but the way we can communicate to our executives can really help us get that money that we need to create mitigation, contingencies, and insurance. And that's what this week's assignment is all about. It's just one way, it's a very simple way, but as long as you've got some basis in numbers to communicate to clients or bosses that they have got to account financially for this piece of any event is helpful. And let's see, and then the last two pieces I wanted to add on to this component is security and safety is also rising in the news. And so anytime it's an issue is being brought to the forefront around events, we want to make sure that we're having a heightened potential awareness or insurance or mitigation around these because safety and security are in the spotlight. So what is being perceived that you're doing? Sometimes I have heard it called security theater, but that is important because you need to show that you're creating a secure location. Sometimes that is visible in security guards, visible in metal detectors, visible in wanding. Sometimes you don't want that because it's a negative perception. But what does your audience want and how is it being perceived? Is that positive? Is that negative? And what's your responsibility as far as security in a location when you're bringing people together? And could it be actionable in court if you did not take some of those actions that you were responsible for? Then just a host of other financial risks. There's things to think about. Our assignment is going to talk about naming some risks and then putting some scores to them. So here's some that you could use. You can think of your own that are more applicable to your situation. But I like to put all of these, and of course inflation is a huge one right now. It sometimes always is, but there's a lot of other ones on the table. And then lastly, I am adding a component this time, which I think is useful to think about when we think about risk. We're building revenue models. We're building financial models where we are hopeful to get in a lot of income, which is exciting. But we can sometimes overshoot that, or an organization can overshoot that. And this is also a helpful way of thinking if you own your own company or your own business, is what is the addressable market size? Which means what are the total amount of customers that if you were able to get in the entire universe of customers that actually want your product? There's only so many people that would want Caspian Agency's product. A surgeon is not going to buy our service. A person who owns a gas station is not going to buy our service. So what is the addressable market size? And then you'll see in the article this week how that breaks down to what might be your realistic market size. Knowing the amount of money that is out there that is potentially capturable by you or your organization helps you manage your financial model to a realistic size. So for our business, when we think about our addressable market, we're not going to be taking the whole $63 billion of event revenue in America. Maybe we're able to obtain this much market, and out of that market, we're going to take this much of a sliver. That gives us a proper goal to shoot for, and when we build our financial models internally, we know we're not overshooting, which is a massive risk when you're thinking of your financial model. It's also something that you could use to speak to executives about why you think your model would work if you're addressing a proper market size. So read that article. I think it's an important concept when we think about risk as well. And that's it. So, sorry, it's a longer one this week, but I think risk is an important item to think about as we look at it, especially in all the factors that are coming at us right now with inflation, with war, with political instability, climate change, potential food shortages, just lots of factors. So I hope this was helpful, and look forward to seeing you hopefully at office hours.